section now. So you know that our section title is Strengthening Justice System for Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights. Okay, before we start our section, let me introduce my name. I'm Quat Thu Hong. I'm working for the Institute for Social Development Study, a Vietnamese NGO focusing work on the gender, sexuality, sexual health, reproductive health and rights, and social inclusion for marginalized groups like LGBT, people living with HIV, people with disability, migrant, drug user, and sex worker. So it's about me, but I now come back to our speaker today. We have 4 speakers, and each speaker will have 15 minutes for their presentation. 10 only? Okay. Yes, up to you, but I was told that each of you will have 15 minutes, but if you finish earlier, it's great. Okay, so let me start with first speaker today, Professor Sofia Gruskin, who sits next to me. Professor Sofia Gruskin is director of the program on global health and human rights at the University of South Carolina Institute for Global Health, and hold appointment as a professor at the Keck School of Medicine and Gao School of Law at USC. She's also lead the USC Law and Global Health Collaboration. Professor Gruskin's work, which range from global policy to grassroots level, has been instrumental in developing the conceptual, methodological, and empirical link between the health and human rights, with a focus on sexual and reproductive health, HIV/AIDS, child and adolescent health and health system. Professor Gruskin has published extensively. She worked in many global and with many global and local partners, and she sits on numerous board and committee on human rights, women's rights, adolescent and child sexual health and reproductive health. Currently, Professor Gruskin is a co-coordinator of the Rights-Oriented Research and Education Network for Sexual and Reproductive Health, an international network of sexual and reproductive health and rights researcher and advocate. So, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here at this meeting, but also to be here in Vietnam, where I'm having the opportunity to meet and to engage again with so many old friends. So what I wish to do in my allotted time is to say first a bit about what I mean about these being complicated times, and then move on to what this means for the sorts of actions that we might take. Where do I point? Here? There. I thought it. I'm trying. Yeah, that's it. I was much stronger than I needed to. Okay. All right, here we are. All right. So the time. It's a strange time. First, as others have talked about, never in history has there been such an opening up, both societally and legally, to the range of things that we now understand to fall under the rubric of sexual and reproductive health and rights. There's large-scale initiatives everywhere to guarantee contraception and family planning like we haven't seen in decades. I'm going to step down here because this feels ridiculous on this thing. Is that okay? Can you still see me? Is that all right? and an unprecedented number of countries that are accepting gay marriage and at least acknowledging the existence of gay, to some degree lesbian, and to some degree transgender populations. And there's a growing recognition of sexual assault and sexual violence as a serious crime by governments, by institutions of power, and even by much of the general populations in many of our countries. So that's a very good thing. At the same time, in 2017, we also see a huge and growing backlash against many aspects of reproductive and sexual health and rights from all corners of the world, including not only outright violence and articulations of homophobia and anti-abortion actions by the range of governments and civil society actors that we're all aware of, but also retrenchments on commitments to comprehensive sexuality education and to other aspects of reproductive and sexual health and rights we once thought were not quite so contentious. And one of the elephants in the room is, of course, the current president of my country. And his administration, in all of the areas that we care about, is doing all possible to dismantle protections for sexual and reproductive health and rights, not only within our own borders within the United States, but across the world. Even in saying this, we can't forget that prior to the Trump administration and prior to the increasingly conservative trends that exist in many of our countries, we already had issues. To be honest, it's not as if the sexual and reproductive health and rights agenda was moving forward without problems in my country, and nor really truly in any of yours. And beyond the issues in our own countries, abortion, reproductive rights, sexual rights, particularly in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity, but also in terms of violence and adolescent sexuality, we're already entangled in South-North, North-South, South-South, North-North politics. And that's a situation that was not helped by political leaders of governments such as my own, such as the US under Obama, or the UK under Cameron, who claimed in their foreign policy that their approach to sexual rights, for example, in relation to sexual orientation, should be mirrored everywhere. So I guess the first point that I'm making is that some of the complexities are not new, and yet many of the issues are. Now, I was in New York a few weeks ago for a meeting at the United Nations where we were trying to move forward some work to improve the health and human rights of women, children, and adolescents. And it was smaller, but it was much like this meeting. There were people from every region of the world, some people from government, from UN agencies, from civil society. And let me say, perhaps not surprisingly, the tone was sober. As you can imagine, there was real concern from everyone in the room about where as a world we are and where as a world we're headed. And we all couldn't help but talk about how different things seem now from the time less than 2 years ago, where we had all last been together, putting together the framework coming off of the recent adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, where the tone, at least in comparison, could now be called almost close to euphoric. At that time, we had been justly concerned about accountability, about ensuring all populations, even those who were traditionally marginalized or discriminated against, were going to be equally supported and equally counted, that sexual and reproductive health and rights receive the proper amounts of attention, and we had all sorts of issues which we thought were incredibly important at the time. But we also had not only a vibrant civil society that was engaged in this work, but we had the financial and the political commitment of all countries in the world, including the United States, for a global course of action and for the SDGs and their idea of leaving no one behind. And my point about the complexity of the time, and the reason I'm telling that story, is that addressing the issues that we care about and work in this area has never been more urgent, despite how complicated this time really is. And with that, I want to voice a concern, which also I think seems to be underlying some of the conversations since we've arrived here, which is that the more constrained that national spaces are becoming, let alone the larger geopolitical space, that this is leading in some cases deliberately, but also in some cases inadvertently, towards our agreement with or even our complicity in reductionist approaches to sexual and reproductive health and rights. Really important issues are being dropped or being de-emphasized And this is often justified as a need to go for the quote-unquote low-hanging fruit. But really, I mean, you know this as well as I do. We risk losing attention and support for the tough issues and for ensuring the sexual and reproductive health of the most difficult to reach and most marginalized populations in each of our societies, even if there's a general concern with doing the right thing. Now, just think of this in relationship to the SDGs, and particularly this idea of leaving no one behind. Now, again, let's be honest here. From the start, the SDGs recognize sexual and reproductive health and rights in a pretty awkward formulation. Whether as a result of fear or of politics, just look at the mismatch between the term sexual and the term reproductive and how that impacted, in fact, the corresponding targets. This inconsistency in terminology has had major implications for the targets and indicators that were set in ways that have had major implications for the sorts of data to be collected by countries in relation to these goals, and therefore what funding is available and for what programs and to what people, and even at the most local level. Issues, topics, rights that address the diversity of sexualities, the intersection of sexual and gender diversity, let alone sexual rights at its most basic, are not a visible part of the SDG agenda. And even as there's some promise in the gender goal in the SDGs, at least as far as it signals attention to interventions that are going to improve equality between women and men, it's fairly clear that the gender intended in the SDGs is a static male-female binary. And so, if we see the SDGs as our blueprint for the future, and we want to ensure that no one is left behind, we need to see these limitations clearly and think strategically about how the SDGs can nonetheless be of use so that reproductive and sexual health and rights can flourish for all people, and even in this current political moment. And so, in short, within and beyond the SDGs, we have to ensure collectively that important issues like adolescent sexuality and the sexual and reproductive health needs and rights of people who are on the margins, whether because their behaviors are criminalized, because they're engaged in sex work or in drug use, or because they're illegally within a country, or because they're living with HIV, or they're intersex, or they're lesbian, or they're gay, or they're transgender, or because they're refugees, or internally displaced, or they live with disabilities, or if they're from a religious or ethnic minority, or they're one, some, or any combination of all of these, that these issues and that their issues do not slide off the table in how we address sexual and reproductive health and rights simply because it's a complicated political moment. And so, in terms of action, I believe that I believe others here perceive a real need to begin a dialogue on priorities and lessons to be learned that are going to be applicable across disciplines, ages, institutions, and continents. And I want to put out a few thoughts for debate and discussion about what this complicated moment might mean for how we do our work. And first, I want to talk about us as individuals, as human beings, because we need to figure out how and when to act. And so, in addition to the sort of sexual and reproductive health and rights issues we've been working on for so long, the complexity of the time means we also have to work together more actively to support people to claim their rights. And as importantly, we have to work together to protect people who advocate for these rights. And so here's the thing, even at this meeting, some of us work in sexual health, some of us work in reproductive health, some of us work in abortion, some of us work in HIV, some of us in contraception, and some mix of some of those. But the issue is we don't all have the same priorities. And that means that even for those of us who are here, we may have an expansive view of reproductive and sexual rights in one domain, but not have the same perspective or interest when it comes to other issues. And what I'm getting at is how the nature of the concern with specific topics, ranging from sexual orientation to sex work to abortion, you name it, whatever it would be, can influence the extent to which, even amongst ourselves, we engage in expansive or restrictive approaches to reproductive and sexual rights and to human rights in general. And yet, I truly believe in this moment, that doesn't matter. Efforts are being made daily to weaken global solidarity, to weaken global principles and global institutions, and we need to collectively keep our eye on this bigger picture. Equality, non-discrimination, universalism, these are key to the work we all do. And all of us need to be sure that all these principles remain central to the work that we're doing. We need to see what we do in the context of the broader negative geopolitical changes that are happening, not only for our own corner of sexual and reproductive health and rights, but for SRH work broadly, for human rights, for global health, and frankly, for what we understand our world to be. And we need to put the differences amongst us about these issues and priorities somewhat on the back burner. I was heartened to hear some really excellent examples already in some earlier sessions, but we need a lot more of this. And we need to move towards maintaining broad coalitions, ones that are aimed at preserving our web of international partnerships, from the people that we work with, to how it is that we work together, to how we understand the work that we do within a framework of international relations, and I'm going to use the word international solidarity. Because once these are gone, they will be monumentally difficult to put back together. Focusing on this action and this kind of work is a matter of prudence to all of our work. It's not a luxury and it's not a distraction. So on these issues, we need to speak up, not just sometimes now, but all the time, even if it's uncomfortable within our institutions, but also within national and international spaces, which is why I'm actually speaking about this today. And a second but related point is that if we see hostility, homophobia, xenophobia, racism, sexism, any forms of discrimination that seem to be given more space or becoming more acceptable because of the current political moment, we need to call it out. And we need to trust in the support that we're going to get from colleagues, not only those who work in SRHR, but also allies outside the world of SRHR who are also struggling within the current negative large-scale changes that are occurring and what it means for all that we're doing. At an institutional level, oops, sorry about that. At an institutional level, and I'm going to reiterate what others have said, we have to ensure that we're not looking at just the existence of sexual and reproductive health information and services alone as sufficient. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And it means systematically paying attention to the range of human rights issues that you see here. And the thing is, all of these are key to addressing the inequalities that exist and are part of what it means to do a rights-based approach to sexual and reproductive health. And that gets to the question of who. The issue is that basically who is to do this work? And in this respect, my biggest concern, believe it or not, is not about what's happening now. My biggest concern is about the next generation, people who are growing up in the current political space. Now, we all know that sexual and reproductive health and rights generate strong opinions that are often steeped in social values and ideology, in religion and morality. The next generations of researchers, of implementers, of policymakers and advocates, how or what they understand about sexual and reproductive health and rights is key to where the field is going to be in 10 years, let alone in 20. Education and training is core to this. There are wonderful young people at this conference, but beyond that, things are not in good shape. There are good training programs, fabulous training programs in different parts of the world, great materials, but even so, they're entirely inadequate to prepare the next generation of students and practitioners in every region, or frankly in any region, to do the rights-oriented sexual and reproductive health and rights work that is needed over the next decade and beyond. I think I can safely say, not just myself, but those of us who work in this area from all regions of the world, who teach and who do research, we're worried about the ability to deliver rights-based sexual and reproductive health services in the decades to come. We need as a priority to put into place cross-topic, cross-region, and cross-generational strategic action plans so that we can ensure attention not only to clinical and technical aspects of SRH, but in the education and training that is done, but that we're able to assure a focus on user autonomy, on user-initiated choices for sexual and reproductive health, and explicit attention to human rights and to the legal, political, economic, social, and cultural issues that are at the foundation of who needs services, who can get them, who cannot get them, and what is done about them. Now, with that said, the issues that brought us here to this conference are relevant not just to this region, they're relevant to countries in all regions of the world, and not least because of the current threat to all that we've been talking about. Who's vulnerable or who's disadvantaged clearly is going to vary between countries and within countries. But this really is the time that we need to stand up for the health, dignity, and human rights of all people everywhere in the world. Ultimately, it's up to all of us to ensure that not only in rhetoric, but in reality, the larger sexual and reproductive health and rights agenda can move forward, even in this complicated times. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. Now it's turn to our second speaker, Professor Terence Hearn. Professor Terence Hearn is a well-known demographer in the region, particularly in Indonesia and Vietnam. He's the one among the first people who helped to build demography and social sciences with demography in Vietnam. So I'm one beneficiary. Professor Terence has involved with APCRSHR from the first conference and has served as the president of the Asian Population Association and the Australian Population Association. In recent years, he has published on a topic in family planning, male and female circumcision, sexual pleasure, demographic history, maternal mortality, population dynamic, and census data quality. Professor Terence Hearn, today's topic is very provocative. You see, just sex. So now, your floor, Professor Hearn.
Thank you very much. I was asked to give a title for a talk in a plenary, and I said, well, I'm just going to talk about just sex. And that's what they put as my title. So I appreciate them taking me seriously. The purpose of this talk is to compare the meanings of the word just, which can be read in two ways. It's sex as just a natural activity, just a pastime, just an instrumental activity, just a way of behaving. But then the other thing is about the morality, the ethics of sex. The just relationships have to follow principles of human rights, with sexual rights being accorded to individuals. This is a strange ambiguity, and it produces some strange ironies. In the next 12 minutes, which I've been given, and I'm just starting that, I have to ask, what is sex? And Rosalia has already told me, whatever you do, don't try and tell this group what is sex. But I do want to say something about what is sex, because we know that President Bill Clinton in the 1990s changed the way that people understood the term sex. He, through his behavior, which was strange, we found that, he said, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. And then less than a year later, he said, I did have an inappropriate relationship with Miss Lewinsky, a relationship that was not appropriate. So he didn't have sex, but he had a relationship. And that leads us to what I regard as the Clinton effect. 2 surveys in America done about a decade apart using similar questions, similar sample design, similar numbers of undergraduates. People were asked, what do you understand as being sex? And you can see here that penile vaginal intercourse, penetrative intercourse, basically no change for males and female between the two surveys. Also penile anal intercourse. They don't always regard it as sex, but there's no change. What changed was the oral intercourse or oral contact. And it's a massive change. It was cut in half. So undergraduates are now regarding oral, what I call oral sex, as not being sex. This is some other category of behavior. What's interesting is that as you do surveys of the abstinence-only education kids, you find out that they say they have not had sex. They've had oral sex, but they haven't had sex. So we have this strange issue of the changing understanding of what sex even is. And if that's the case, and I won't go into the details of Bill Clinton and being taken to court and Monica Lewinsky being called to be a witness for a previous lover. You know, I mean, this guy had some real serious issues. But what you can say is that this kind of behavior tells us something about the people we deal with in education programs and surveys and so forth, and how we need to be extremely careful with our language so that we understand what they are telling us as much as they understand what we are asking them. We've got some real sexual harassers around the world now, and they're in the papers every day. We have a question, you know, when is harassment sexual harassment? And in the newspapers, as I read these stories about Charlie Rose and Roy Moore, this is a real wingding candidate for Senate who is being defended. He did not have inappropriate underage sex because there are country and western songs talking about how beautiful a 15-year-old might be or a 16-year-old. And so they're defending him on that. John Conyers and Al Franken are trying to explain what they admit is inexplicable. They did something wrong. But having said they did something wrong, then what is the next step? And we have the groper-in-chief, who is now, through his press secretary, sort of denying that he ever said what he was recorded as saying about groping pussies and having inappropriate relations with a whole range of people. So we know that harassment could be sexual harassment if it's an unwelcome, unwanted sexual behavior which makes a person feel offended, humiliated, or intimidated. Those are pretty clear. We know that it can be verbal, visual, written, or physical. In the ANU system, we had a case recently of a young woman who was having sex with a man in her room. He had his telephone switched on, and it was recording to the next room what the events were going on. And of course, you know, this was terrible because they took the recording down to the breakfast area the next morning and played it in front of all of her peers. I mean, this is outrageous. What does a university do about this? How do you handle it? You've got two students, some with really outrageous behavior, some who really need some help. I asked an Indian colleague about whether there were some celebrities in India that I could put in with John Conyers and all the rest of them. She said, "Are you kidding? Every man in India." So I tried to get a picture. And I think it's almost every man. There's a couple of women in there too, though. But we do have to realize that the pictures of these celebrities, these are individuals, and we're dealing with a problem that is really much wider. It's in every one of our offices, every one of our institutions. And until we stop thinking about the one person who is the Bill Clinton or the Donald Trump, and start thinking about all of us and what our behavior is and how our behavior is interpreted, we are going to have some real problems dealing with harassment. Now, sexual assault is somewhat different, because sexual assault is engaging in a defined sexual act without consent of the other person in the process of establishing that a defendant has committed a criminal offense. It must be demonstrated that the complainant was not consenting to the sexual act. It's a question of a physical act. This is under Australian law and actually discussed in many other legal systems as well. These issues of the physical act then become matters of argument about saying, was this really, did it really happen? Have you got evidence? Where are the witnesses? Under some legal jurisdictions, you have to have 3 or 4 witnesses of a rape. You know, this is, by its very nature, a nonsense. We have issues of consent. So, did someone give consent? In both harassment and in assault, there is a serious set of questions surrounding the nature of a person's ability to give consent. When we talk about so many people being given drugs or alcohol or other pressures, sometimes just sheer coercion, then you can't talk about free consent. Yet that is often the defense that people bring up when they start talking about these issues. In university surveys in the USA and Australia, I tried to put all the data together and I thought, nobody's going to be able to read that. So I'm trusting you to trust me that around 10% of undergraduate respondents said they had experienced non-consensual penetration by force or incapacitation in a university setting with some research. Reports vary. Some say 25%, and some say 13.5%. A lot of people have very specific numbers. The real problem is trying to get data on something like this with a voluntary survey, because people who volunteer to do a survey may be more or less likely to report the reality of their own experiences. And so we don't have abilities to have compulsory surveys of every student as they graduate. You get your degree and you write your report about all the professors who cracked onto you. That's not going to happen. In Australia, 10% of females were assaulted, but half of students were harassed. So going back to that harassment being all these kinds of verbal and everything, we have these problems that those are the average students, but it's even worse for people who are LGBTQI identifying. The risk of harm among disabled students who are harassed or assaulted is also greater. But the studies for those students probably have to be specialized studies, specialized surveys. People, a number of writers in the US have said that the Asians in their surveys are much more conservative. They're different, you know, they don't have the issues that the American students have. And they found that there were few surveys who had good data about ethnicity and so on. What I found interesting was that we are promoting scientific studies in Asia, and so I immediately thought, well, why don't I go to the Asian studies and find out where they are? And they are everywhere. If you stop by the Public Health Association's booth, you can pick up this report, which has a lovely article about harassment, which includes personal reflections in Vietnam. We also have China with a recent study that showed 1 in 3 students in Chinese universities had experienced sexual harassment or violence, so 1 in 3. We find that the most common form was verbal sexual harassment, followed by the second most common form was being forced to kiss or touch private parts. Again, back to the Bill Clinton effect. Was this sex or not? Around 7% of the Chinese students in these universities said they'd been forced to undress or expose themselves in front of some other group. 4% had forced penetrative intercourse, which we would call rape. Now, these are numbers that are really of great concern to anyone working in universities. If your students are coming into class having experienced a weekend where they've been subject to this kind of pressure, you don't expect them to be able to concentrate on calculus and the poems of Shelley. I mean, or maybe poems of Shelley then. Our conference is full of papers that are looking at some of these issues. Tomorrow there's a satellite session, 12 o'clock, where Jennifer and John are going to be talking about surveys that they've been involved with at Columbia University, and they're also referring to they have other speakers from other countries. You should really try and get to that. Grab your lunchbox and run. Don't miss the super poster sessions either. They've got some things on harassment there. This is not so new and not so good news about campus sex, that where people who have been charged with sexual harassment or assault suddenly end up bringing in the lawyers. And the lawyers are defending what might be regarded as the indefensible. I should go back on that. I had a personal experience when I was an undergraduate on an honor court or disciplinary court of a university where a group of fraternity men, this is in 1965, were charged with raping someone using a drug. And the drug was, rendered the woman unconscious. She remembered enough to identify people, and the next thing you know, there was a New York lawyer representing the fraternity, defending these men and demanding that it go to civil court. This was a question of whether these kids should be thrown out of university, and I think that basically they should have been. But imagine, as a 19-year-old at that stage, my ability to deal with this lawyer who is starting to quote the various statutes, and we have to make decisions. In the end, they were thrown out, and their parents probably just sent them to a better university that they could afford. But we now have a new Trumpian person who is going to change the quality of evidence needed in university or young people's claims of harassment. And she has withdrawn, Betsy DeVos has withdrawn an Obama ruling that would have protected women in these situations. And this is just, I mean, this is one of thousands of these decisions, but it does make a very difficult problem more difficult. In Australia, we have a wonderful author, Benjamin Law, who has been defending the Safe Schools Initiative, which was essentially a means of educating children in Australian schools to understand and be tolerant of each other's sexuality. And we suddenly have parents who are saying, this program is teaching my child how to put condoms on, and it's all fake. But what Benjamin Law has done is to analyze the degree to which this fakeness is carried on by the major conservative newspaper, which has got a constant stream of stories condemning safe schools. It is important to have good programs. It's also important to recognize our enemies. And what Benjamin Law has done is to tell us that we've got some serious enemies there in the space of reproductive and sexual health. And unless we start dealing with them more effectively, we're not going to be able to have clear programs on reproductive and sexual health, preventing harassment and other forms of sexual assault. The take home that I would like to give you, though, is that harassment and assault are issues that we've got to grapple with. What are the differences? Some people say, well, it's a continuum. Well, maybe. Whatever it is, when we start doing samples and surveys to try and do something about it, we've got to be concerned about our sample size. Most studies are too small to really reach the conclusions they want to reach. We've got to do something about the way people are selected. It's probably not a good idea to go through your Google address book to select your sample respondents. And we've got to do something about the validity using standard definitions. And we should be doing these surveys regularly, which means somebody's got to put up some money to pay for them. And the money is going to be substantial. So I hope that it's here. But at the end of the day, the real problem in Asia is we have to be socially transparent and individually confidential, meaning when the results come out, we want them to come out. And when they come out, they shouldn't be shaming or blaming individuals who answered the survey. So thank you very much, and I hope the future presentations will expand on it.
Thank you very much, Terry. Now we have to listen to our third speaker, Marilyn Dangilan. Her presentation has a title, Contention and Compromise, How the RH Bill Became Law. Marilyn Dangilan is now the Country Director of Population Service, Philippines. She has a very impressive education attainment, as you see in her bio. She used to work in the different UN agencies and international organizations. She the author of various books. The first one is The Making Choice in Good Faith, a challenge to the Catholic Church teaching on sexuality and contraception, thus won the Nation Book Award in 1993. Her latest book is The Contention and Compromise, How the RH Bill Became Law. I guess her presentation now is part of her latest book. Please, your flow.
Good afternoon to everybody. I'm so glad to be here. And it's really nice to get out of Manila. And also, I really want to thank my close friend and dear friend, Leah Shortino, for inviting me over. It's really my privilege, Leah. So when Leah Shortino invited me to this conference, she said I could talk about my book. I just finished it and it came out. Its title is Contentions and Compromises, How the Reproductive Health Bill Became Law. To write this book, I had to go through thousands of documents, and I'm not exaggerating. From the 1980s up to this year, a period spanning 37 years. These documents were mostly official transcripts of the debates during the drafting of our 1987 Constitution and the passage of the RH Bill through Congress. As I was going through them, I was shocked, actually, and appalled by the sexism and misogynism of many members of the justice and legislative systems and those in other powerful policy-making circles in my country. For instance, a constitutional commissioner, who is also a member of the conservative Opus Dei, gave a speech persuading his colleagues that the provision, equal protection of the mother and the unborn from conception should be enshrined in the Constitution. He said, his argument was, the fertilized egg has human life for 3 reasons. First, the fertilized egg has 46 chromosomes, 23 from the sperm and 23 from the egg. And he emphasized only human beings have 46 chromosomes. Well, he was wrong there. Certain kinds of deer, rat, antelope, and mice also have 46 chromosomes. Second, the fertilized egg takes in nutrients, divides, and grows. And third, he said, the fertilized egg has all the basic elements of humanity, and thus it will eventually become a human being, not a frog. So when a fertilized egg is expelled from the uterus, that constitutes abortion. And anything that expels the fertilized egg from the uterus is considered an abortifacient. He called this murder. If a woman, he said, were mentally ill, this is not a valid reason for abortion. A woman's mental illness does not necessarily cause the same mental illness in the fetus, he reasoned. If a woman were raped, this is not a reason for abortion. There are other humane ways of helping the agony of women who have been raped. He said they could always seek guidance and counseling from the nuns in the convents. If a woman were carrying a deformed fetus, he argued, abortion is never a solution. He said humane solutions to disabilities lie in the social and loving concern and abilities of the more fortunate. The women commissioners objected vehemently to his statements, but he still insisted, quote, a woman has absolutely no right to murder the child, unquote. Only when it is medically impossible to save the mother and the fetus, then if one is to save the mother's life, that is morally and legally permissible. Therefore, to this day, we have the clause in our present Constitution that reads, the state shall equally protect the life of the mother and the unborn from conception. All this happened in 1986. Of course, things have changed, but not significantly so, not in sexual and reproductive health and rights. During the debates of the Reproductive Health Bill, the same sexism and misogynism prevailed among the anti-RH legislators. An anti-RH legislator, during the amendments of the bill, told one of the authors of the RH bill, this was in the middle of the debates, "You're beautiful." He even asked her if she's single, implying that she wouldn't know the joys of coming home to children. Anti-RH legislators tried to delete the phrase, the management of post-abortion care, in the RH bill. They argued that this provision would encourage women to have more abortions or to have abortions. Anti-RH legislators also tried to remove the provision that government funds contraceptives because they said contraceptives then would tempt was the word, women, and thus violate their religious belief. And anti-RH legislators tried to ban all artificial methods of contraception because of their abortifacient effects, and tried to limit women's choice to the Billings method and other natural methods. They attempted to cripple the RH bill, even if they knew that women were dying from the complications of abortion, pregnancy, and childbirth, even if they knew that they would perpetuate a system that is so discriminatory because only women get pregnant and only women die from the complications of abortion and pregnancy. During the voting of the RH bill in December 2012, they voted against it because it mocked the revered authority of the Catholic Church. Because my final act should be in fidelity with what my church stands for, and because I cannot turn a blind eye to this onslaught against my faith and moral conviction. The reasons behind this could possibly be that they feared the Catholic Church and what it could do to them, or they fervently believed in its teachings, even if a Jesuit priest, who is also a lawyer, wrote that the Catholic Church's teaching on artificial contraception is not considered infallible. So 2 weeks, barely 2 weeks after President Benigno Aquino III signed the RH bill into law, what do you know? The Catholic groups filed a petition immediately with the Supreme Court. They wrote, the RH law violated the constitutional provision on the equal protection of the mother and the unborn, among others. As a result, the Supreme Court did not allow the government to implement the law until this question was resolved. It took the Supreme Court over 2 years before it declared the RH law not unconstitutional. So it means it's constitutional. After this, in 2015, another group filed another petition with the Supreme Court and claimed that implants were abortifacients. So the Supreme Court again issued a temporary restraining order on all contraceptives, including implants. And this would only be lifted, they said, if the Food and Drug Administration would declare that these are not abortifacients. But remember what our definition of abortifacient is. The fertilized egg should, you know. So after over 2 years, just this month on November 12, the FDA declared that 51 contraceptives, including implants, were not abortifacients. For now, the government is able to distribute contraceptives throughout the country. But Catholic groups, I hear, want to repeal even this FDA order. So what else will they do? We don't know, but for sure, they will move heaven and earth to block the full implementation of the RH law. This is not a hopeless situation, though. Remember, we made the RH bill, the RH bill became law after 11 years. The Supreme Court lifted the temporary restraining order, and contraceptives are now going through the government pipelines. But then again, how do you strengthen justice systems and legislative systems for sexual and reproductive health and rights? How do we ensure that the women and men who are in these systems understand, appreciate, advance, and uphold sexual and reproductive health and rights? How do we make them accountable when they, for instance, want to increase penalties for women who get abortions, or when they try to declare entire cities or towns as pro-life, meaning no artificial contraceptives are allowed, or when they file a bill that intends to repeal the RH law? How do we make these people accountable? When somebody like Manny Pacquiao, who quotes the Bible, is in the Senate, one gets to think that, things look dim. Although there's only one Manny Pacquiao, there are several others who think like him, and they are in Congress. Well, Manny Pacquiao is our world international championship boxing, whatever. But take heart, there are several other groups, women's groups, health groups, faith-based organizations, and professional groups who pressure, watch, and assist those in the justice and legislative systems, and who know how to use social media strategically. They persisted in the past, they continue to persist now, and they will persist in the future. And with what I've seen, we will win this war. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. It's very strong, very inspiring. Thank you. And now we have our fourth speaker, Mrs. Marja Beera. Is correctly, your name is correctly spelled. Mrs. Marja Beera have been working in the field of abortion rights and reproductive and sexual rights, health and rights in the United Kingdom and internationally since 1976. And she keep working as the book editor, as the author, as the advocate, as a speaker, guest lecturer in that field for many years until 1996 and 2001. She worked as first chairwoman of the Gender Advisory Panel, Department of Reproductive Health and Research, Special Program of Research Development and Research Training in Human Reproduction at WHO. She also chaired the steering committee of the International Consortium for Medical Abortion from 2002 to 2011. Now your turn, Marge.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the conference organizers, and particularly Leah Shortino for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to have come to Vietnam for this conference. I'm going to, my title is slightly different from the one that's in your program. I was supposed to talk about the justice system, but I felt that in the context of the other presentations and issues around abortion, that I should talk more about abortion law and policy, and partly to do also with the justice system. Criminal restrictions on abortion. Abortion is regulated in most countries in the criminal and civil law, passed by parliaments and subject to the control of the justice system. That includes the police, the courts, and the prisons. When I wrote this, I thought to myself, we've studied a great deal what parliaments do around abortion, and we've studied a great deal what courts do around abortion, but we haven't really looked at the role of the police in countries where prosecutions are, sorry about the microphone, where prosecutions are currently taking place. And although a great deal of work has been done about the role of the police in domestic violence, less has been done in relation to abortion. So that's a research issue I would like to put on everybody's agenda, although in fact the Asia region is not the place where most prosecutions for abortion are taking place, which is a very nice thing to be able to say. Other ways that abortion can be liberalized, restricted, or regulated, and my God, abortion is more restricted and regulated than almost any other activity in humanity that women are involved in. In national constitutions, it may be covered, and that happens in at least 20 countries that we know of. Supreme Court rulings have been handed down on abortion, for example, in the United States, Canada, Colombia, and Brazil. There have been Supreme Court judgments in case law and appeals, such as the cases in India over the last months that have been given so much publicity, to do both with children who've been sexually abused and had to go to court to get permission to have an abortion, and women who discovered they were carrying a serious fetal anomaly in a pregnancy and also had to go to court to get permission to have an abortion because in both cases they were beyond 20 weeks of pregnancy. And lastly, there are a myriad of regulations, issues around consent and age requirements, and on and on. So my role in life as the coordinator of the international campaign has become one of, partially, of trying to argue for the decriminalization of abortion. And decriminalizing means removing criminal sanctions against abortion, which is much easier said than done. It means not punishing anyone for providing a safe abortion, not punishing anyone for having an abortion, not involving the police in investigating or prosecuting safe abortion, not involving the courts in deciding whether to allow an abortion. And in a positive way, it means treating abortion like every other form of health care. And if, in fact, certain problems take place and somebody violates women's rights, using other existing laws to deal with any coercive, dangerous, or negligent practices. Now, there's a discussion to be had I think, in the abortion rights movement that hasn't yet materialized in a good enough way. For many years, we've been calling for safe, legal abortion. That's been one of our main slogans. But legalizing abortion actually means keeping abortion in the law in some positive way by identifying the grounds on which it's allowed. On the other hand, that means it implies that there are some grounds where it isn't allowed. More recently, we've begun to call for decriminalization of abortion. And from my point of view, I think this is an important aspect of progress. But what's been happening is when you change terminology in a movement, you find that it's much easier to change for yourself and very difficult to get the other 7 billion people on the earth to change with you. So people have begun to use both terms interchangeably, thinking that they mean the same thing, when in fact they don't. And I think there's a serious conversation to be had amongst us what those differences actually are. Canada, in fact, is the only country to date that, through a Supreme Court decision in 1988, decriminalized abortion altogether. And it's thought, at least by Western researchers, that China has no legal restrictions on abortion and never has had. But I would appeal to our Chinese colleagues here, if that's actually a wrong perception, to let us know what the correct information is. This is a neat little graph. It shows that the main legal grounds for abortion in the laws of almost every country are only a list of 6 different issues. And as you go down that list from save the life, through preserve the health, rape, fetal anomaly, economic or social reasons, and on request, you find that they cover more and more abortions. And in fact, the reason most women have an abortion is because they have an unwanted pregnancy. The rest of these grounds apply to smaller and smaller numbers as you go back up the list. And certainly as a country becomes healthier, the need to save women's lives by doing an abortion pretty much disappears. And the graph shows, if you see, you can make a line going parallel to the right, going down, that with each one of these grounds, and the dots are all countries, with each one of these grounds, if you add it to the law, you get fewer and fewer deaths from abortion until you get to abortion on request, where you see on the right-hand side there, almost all countries have no deaths from unsafe abortion. The other trouble with the law on abortion is that other laws actually interfere with it and complicate it even more. And I'll give you an example from Morocco because it's an unusual example. In the last couple of years, there's been public debate on the fact that a large number of women are dying from unsafe abortions. So the king actually issued a directive to reform the law to expand legal protections for women. Now, according to the Moroccan Family Planning Association, there's now a kind of national consensus that abortion within the first 3 months of pregnancy should be permitted if the woman's physical and mental health is at risk and in cases of rape, incest, or congenital malformation. However, they also said that unmarried women would probably be excluded from such a law because it is illegal in Morocco to have sex outside marriage. And that's an interesting way that other laws can impinge and make things even more difficult. And of course, as we all know very well in Asia, laws related to sex determination and selection have been passed in India, Vietnam, China, and South Korea on and off in the past few decades, affecting particularly access to second trimester abortion. But I would like to say that from where I sit, things are getting better with abortion despite all the negative things going on in the world. In recent decades, a combination of sustained campaigning by women, by NGOs, with support from human rights bodies and all sorts of professionals involved in the field, health workers, legal experts. There have been legal reforms, positive court rulings, enabling regulations, and public health guidelines that have improved access to safe abortion for women. Supreme courts have also been instrumental in interpreting the constitutionality of abortion and allowing specific grounds, for example, Brazil, Colombia, and most recently, Chile. And in every region except Africa, deaths from unsafe abortion have been decreasing. And one of the reasons, other reasons, apart from law change and so on, that is happening is that women are taking safe abortion into their own hands with medical abortion pills. I'm not going to read this whole slide out to you. It's a bunch of percentages of numbers of countries where abortion is legal on the different grounds I showed you earlier. I think it's most important to say two things about these figures. First of all, abortion is legally permitted to save the life of the woman, thank you, everybody, in 98% of the world's countries. And one of the few countries left where that was not the case, Chile, finally changed their law this year. So there are only, I think, 5 or 6 countries left to take that step. But the third paragraph there, I think, the second paragraph shows you that as you go down the list of the 6 grounds for abortion, fewer and fewer countries have those grounds, and abortion on request is available in the fewest countries overall. And the second thing that this third paragraph tells you is that abortion is permitted on request in the first trimester of pregnancy in 65% of developed countries, but only 14% of developing countries. And for economic and social reasons in 75% of developed countries, but only 19% of developing countries. So the implication there is that the global north is doing better on this issue than the global south, and I'm sure we all understand what the reasons are for that. Mainly because I think a lot of these campaigns that we're involved in have been around much longer in the global north. And of course, the global north imposed illegal abortion on the global south through colonialism, so there's a lot of history involved there. Changing the law to benefit women takes years and decades. I've been involved in this work for 35 years. I've seen a lot of change. In Britain, where we've had a decent law since 1967, we're still fighting anti-abortion efforts to restrict the law. Anybody who wants to get into this business really has to decide to put their energy in it in the long term. And if you want to change a law, you have to decide what you want to end up with before you start campaigning for it, because if you get a chance, it'll come once and it won't come again soon. And you can ask for too little and end up spending decades trying to improve on that. You can ask for too much and lose out. And at some point, in some space, you have to figure out what's practical, what's feasible to ask for that you think you can get. And the more allies you have, basically, the better. Trends in 2017, one of the privileges of my work at the moment is to be able to read about what's happening to abortion all over the world and share it twice a week. And some of the trends that we've seen this year in terms of abortion is that we found that women are in the streets marching for abortion rights somewhere every month this year and fighting for all sorts of other aspects of abortion law reform. Every month we have reported that at least one government or court has taken steps towards progressive law reform, or at least a national leader has spoken out in favor of law reform. And thirdly, every month a UN human rights body or a special rapporteur has advised a country or the whole world to make abortion safe and permit it on a wider range of grounds. None of them has yet called for abortion on request, but ironically, they do call for abortion to be decriminalized. So that's also a very interesting picture there. And they have discussed abortion in terms of the right to life and health, in terms of gender equity, and in terms of ending violence and even torture of women. Okay. I'm sure I'm going over my 15 minutes, but I won't be too much longer. I wanted to bring up two issues that happened this year. One, which I think was among the most appalling series of events that I have ever seen in India, cases of sexual abuse of girls who get pregnant as young as age 10. And when they started to hit the newspapers in India, then they started to come more stories would come into the newspapers, and then these cases would go to courts in various parts of the country, and some judges would allow abortions and others would not. And because there are children involved, their pregnancy is not identified until quite late, and then they have to go to court because they're beyond 20 weeks. And those cases, I think, the situation has been partially resolved, but it's not clear yet. I mean, the country needs to reform the law around this issue and is likely to have a great deal of difficulty doing so, given the circumstances. A very nice story and an unexpected one, including for the women involved in this photograph, is that in South Korea last year, when we were calling in the campaign for solidarity with Poland, where they were threatened with a total ban on abortion, a group of young women in South Korea decided to do a solidarity campaign and organize a protest. And they dressed, in Poland they called it a black protest, and everybody dressed in black. And in South Korea they did the same. And this year, during the course of this year, they formed a joint action for reproductive justice network and got a whole lot of different groups joined up. And for the 28th of September this year, they put a petition out for signatures calling on the President of South Korea to engage in abortion law reform. And the President had said that any petition received with more than 200,000 signatures would be considered. So they, to their own great surprise, they got 235,000 signatures with almost no difficulty, which I have to say, having tried to get signatures on a petition for years, is quite an accomplishment. And they were quite amazed at the passion with which a lot of people actually signed that petition. They handed it in to the President and were happy to be told that the content of the petition would be considered. I just want to close by mentioning the 28th of September. It's International Safe Abortion Day. It has been celebrated as an International Day of Action since 1990. primarily in Latin America up until the last 5 or 6 years, when it was internationalized by the Women's Global Network for Reproductive Rights, and the campaign has also taken it on as an important day to promote each year. This year we adopted the SDG logo, which you see up on the screen. We changed the colors into our own colors, but we also adopted the hashtag, leaving no one behind, because we wanted to make the statement to our leaders that the right to safe abortion is an essential part of sustainable development for women. I'll do a 2-second plug for the campaign. It's 5 years old this year. We invite you to join us, those of you who are working on abortion, and at least once a year on the 28th of September to do something to celebrate the day. The campaign has over 1,250 groups and individuals in 120 countries, and we would be very happy to work with you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you much. Ladies and gentlemen, because we started our section 25 minutes later, so I request you to stay for 15 more minutes for question and answer. Because our section is about justice, I want to keep the equal right for my panelists to present the paper which they prepare. They spend many hours to prepare, so please stay for 15 more minutes for question and comment. Please, now floor is open to the audience. Any questions? Please,
what an impressive panel of discussants. So thank you very much for provoking us to think about things in a number of different ways. It's more of a comment to you, Marge, and I really feel for you trying to change the discourse around legalising abortion to decriminalisation. And because in fact what we actually know is that for women, decriminalisation will be much better for them and give them more rights than being legalised and having to be subjected to a number of other kinds of laws and prohibitions. And so in my country, Papua New Guinea, we have certainly taken, and let's be clear, decriminalisation is far more radical than legalisation. And in my country, Papua New Guinea, we are doing the same with the Sodomy Act and the unnatural acts between man, which we inherited from British colonial law. We are trying to decriminalise, but people cannot get around the legal terminology, and the press get onto this. They are saying we're calling for legalisation. We don't want to legalise brothels. We can't organise anything in Papua New Guinea. Everything's so poorly regulated. How could we regulate a brothel, let alone the health issues, the cleaning of the bed sheets, all those kinds of health regulations? So I hear your call, but I think it is such a very, very profound and important shift from going from legalisation for decriminalisation, and well done, because that gives women more and more rights.
anyone want to respond? No? Yeah. More question, comment? Yeah. So actually, I think people is now tired a bit. So now, So I would like to thank, oh, sorry, I can't see it.
Yeah.
Could you please?
There are actually two, I guess. Someone in the middle also raised her hand. Okay, I'm Ika, I'm from Indonesia. I have two questions. The first one is related to what the question before, like about the decriminalization and bringing it into a legal law. Maybe I want, yeah, we in Indonesia we have, yeah, a restriction in legal, and also we have a very huge challenge on the, yeah, moral and religious norm, and also it's the challenge can be so real, like right in front of our, yeah, for women who can get criminalized, like even for going to a hospital who wants to get a care for their post-abortion. That's the first question, is like about the decriminalization. I guess there will be two different levels, or I don't know, maybe March can giving more insight about it. And the second question is for for Terry. Yeah, about sexual assault or sexual violence in the campus, in the college, or in the university. We, like I propose, yeah, I'm currently working for a workshop and also writing paper about sexual violence or even violence against women in the campus. But the challenge that we usually face is like having that issue into an academic discussion is really hard to be proposed. So I don't know, maybe Terry can give more insight about, yeah, bringing up this discussion into an academic, because I ever rejected when I tried to have a research on how many women or how many people get ever get assault in the campus. Yeah, I think that's for my question. Thank you.
Please, quick answer, please.
Thank you. To my friend from PNG, I'd like to talk. You made a comment rather than ask a question, so let's talk in the coffee break. I'm rather hard of hearing, so I can't hear a great deal from this distance, even when people speak into microphones. In terms of the question from a friend from Indonesia, every country is a different story, in my opinion, in terms of how one has to go about trying to change the law. And what you need is as many allies from different perspectives as possible. The most important one being the women of the country. To get the women of the country on your side is to put together the power to influence the others who are in power to make the change. And I think the most important groups of people to get on your side in terms of those who are in power is different groups in the health system, different types of legal experts, including those who know how to write laws that are actually good for people. People involved in the court system can be very helpful, human rights bodies, parliamentarians, very important people to have on your side. If you can find parliamentarians who are prepared to stick their neck out and actually put reform bills into the parliament, that's very helpful. And lastly, the media. And because of the existence now of social media as the best way to get to young women and reach young women, I think that form of media is perhaps your most important one. And your second is to get influential journalists who are prepared to write articles that support your work and that report your work properly and not with all sorts of bias against you.
In terms of trying to get academics to do more research, more studies, and the barriers that they face, I think that this is where professional organizations play a very important role. One of the problems in Indonesia is that many of the professional organizations are either captured by government interests, or they are fundamentally weak. And that requires professionals to gather together and improve their own organizations. This is a remarkable conference that has been going now 18 years with no institutional base that is common. And somehow, every 2 years, we get together and we have remarkable exchanges of ideas and remarkable networking. Within countries, we need to have some sort of energy to do the same thing. So I encourage you to join your professional organizations, get them moving, and have them speak with a common voice to the people who are the barriers to your research.
I think it's now time for coffee and break, but before we go for coffee and tea, please join me to thank our excellent speaker. And if you have more question or comment or exchange, I think you can feel free to meet our speaker during the tea break. Thank you. Thank you so much, our excellent speaker.